a White House security staffer, a young woman dead in a bathroom, and a story that, from the very beginning, sounds like the kind of explanation people repeat because they hope it will somehow make an impossible scene feel simpler than it is. According to investigators, 25-year-old Nation Wood told police that he was dry firing a gun inside the San Francisco apartment he shared with his 22-year-old girlfriend, Samantha Emge. He said he believed the weapon was unloaded, but one shot was fired. That bullet allegedly traveled through a wall and struck Samantha while she was in the bathroom. She was rushed to the hospital. She did not survive. And now the question hanging over this case is the same one that so many people asked the moment they first heard it. How does something like this happen? Because this was not a teenager playing with a weapon he didn't understand. Nation Wood had a background in high-level security work. He had reportedly worked in roles connected to White House security operations during the Biden administration. His professional history suggested someone who understood risk, procedure, and control. Someone who knew better than to be careless with a firearm. So when that same person says this was a horrific accident, people naturally stop and look closer. Was it really just a devastating act of negligence? Or is this one of those cases where the physical evidence may tell a more complicated story than the first explanation offered at the scene? Tonight, we need to walk through that carefully. Because at the center of this case is a young woman who should still be here. Samantha Emge had recently graduated from San Francisco State University. She studied interior design and architecture. She was building a future. She was working in design. She was sharing pieces of her life, her travel, her creativity, and her relationship online, like so many young people do when life feels like it is finally beginning to open up. And now, instead of celebrating what came next, her family is living with a version of grief that is almost impossible to accept. The kind of grief that comes with a single violent moment inside a home. Before we go deeper, I want to ask you something. When you hear a case like this, what is the first thing that stands out to you? Is it the fact that a gun was allegedly fired inside an apartment? Is it the fact that Samantha was in another room? Or is it the background of the man now charged in her death? And while you listen, let me know where you're watching from tonight. I always want to know which city you're joining from. And if you care about cases that deserve attention beyond the mainstream headlines, subscribe and stay with us. Stories like this can disappear quickly unless people keep talking about them, because this one should not disappear. It was late on the night of March 24, 2026, when San Francisco police responded to a home on 22nd Avenue in the Sunset District. Officers arrived to find a young woman suffering from a gunshot wound. Emergency crews tried to save her. She was taken to the hospital. But despite those efforts, Samantha Emge died. The public facts, at least so far, are brutally simple. She was 22 years old. She lived with Nation Wood. Police say she was shot inside the apartment, and the man accused in her death says it was an accident. That word, accident, has become the emotional center of the case. It is the word that makes everything feel divided, because for some people, it explains the tragedy. For others, it does not even begin to explain it. Let's slow down and look at who these two people were. Samantha Emge was not just a name in a headline. By all accounts, she was young, talented, and creative. She had recently graduated from San Francisco State University, where she focused on design-related studies. She worked as a design assistant. Her social media painted the picture of someone who loved architecture, travel, beautiful spaces, and the possibility of building a life through creativity. There were photos from trips, photos of everyday moments, and the kind of hopeful energy that comes with being in your early 20s and believing there is still so much time. And there should have been. Nation Wood, meanwhile, was also a San Francisco State graduate. But what made his name immediately stand out in coverage of the case was his reported security background. His LinkedIn profile described experience in site security and advance work for events with high-profile attendees. There were references to work alongside the Secret Service and support tied to then Vice President Kamala Harris during APEC-related activity in San Francisco. A White House spokesperson reportedly confirmed he had been employed as part of the Biden administration. That matters. Maybe not in the legal sense by itself, but in the public sense, it matters a lot. Because when a person with that kind of background says, "I thought the gun was unloaded," people don't hear that the same way they would if it came from someone with no training at all. They hear it differently. They hear, "You knew firearms. You knew safety culture. You knew what one mistake could do. So how did this happen anyway?" That is where this case becomes more than a tragic headline. It becomes a case about credibility, about whether the story given in the immediate aftermath of Samantha's death is consistent with the evidence, the training, the environment, and the choices that allegedly led up to the shot. According to media reports citing sources familiar with the investigation, Nation Wood told police he was dry firing the weapon. For anyone unfamiliar with that term, dry firing refers to pulling the trigger on a firearm without live ammunition being discharged. It can be part of legitimate practice. People use it to work on trigger control, grip, sight alignment, and mechanics. But there is one condition that makes the entire practice safe. The gun must actually be unloaded. If there is a live round in the chamber, then this is not dry firing in any safe or meaningful sense. It is simply firing a loaded gun. And that is where the explanation starts to fray for a lot of people. Because according to this account, the gun discharged, the bullet traveled through a wall, and Samantha, who was reportedly in the bathroom, was struck and killed. Just pause there for a second. Think about the physical scene. Think about the apartment layout. Think about one room, another room, a wall in between, and a woman who may have had no idea that in the next instant, her life was going to end. And ask yourself, how many things have to go wrong for that to happen? A gun has to be loaded when it is not supposed to be. A person has to point it in a direction that is unsafe. A trigger has to be pulled. A wall has to be penetrated. And another human being has to be directly in the line of that round. That is not one mistake. That is a chain. And whenever a death comes from a chain of preventable decisions, people start asking whether accident is a sufficient word, or whether it becomes a shield people reach for when negligence is too obvious to deny. After the shooting, Nation Wood reportedly remained at the scene. His defense attorney later described his behavior as cooperative and said he focused entirely on getting Samantha help. That matters too. It may be significant. It may be consistent with someone in shock after a catastrophic mistake, but it does not answer the deeper question of what exactly happened before the shot was fired. And that question is where investigators usually begin looking beyond emotion and into physical evidence. Because in a case like this, the scene speaks, the wall speaks, the bullet path speaks, the weapon speaks, the location of the shooter speaks, the location of the victim speaks, and Samantha's injuries speak. Even before any final reconstruction is complete, the mechanics of a shooting can reveal whether a story makes sense as described. If a bullet passes through a wall, it may deform. It may lose some energy. It may strike additional materials, drywall, wood studs, tile, fiberglass shower surfaces, any number of barriers, before entering a body. That changes how the wound may appear. It changes trajectory calculations. It changes the analysis. But it does not erase the central fact. A lethal shot was fired in a confined domestic space. And that alone is enough for many people to say this was criminally reckless, even if it was not intentional. Nation Wood has been charged with involuntary manslaughter. He pleaded not guilty. Under California law, involuntary manslaughter generally refers to an unlawful killing without malice, often associated with criminal negligence. In plain language, that means prosecutors are not currently alleging he intended to kill Samantha, but they are alleging that his conduct was reckless enough to make him criminally responsible for her death. That distinction matters. And yet, cases like this often make people uncomfortable with legal labels, because the emotional reality feels bigger than the charge itself. If someone dies because a loaded firearm was handled carelessly inside a home, families don't experience that as a technical classification. They experience it as a life ripped apart. Samantha's family does not get their daughter back because the law describes the act as involuntary rather than intentional. They do not get to rewind the night because someone says it was a mistake. That is one of the most painful truths in cases involving firearms and intimate relationships. Intent matters in court, but loss feels absolute no matter what label comes later. At Wood's court appearance, Prosecutors reportedly argued that he posed a flight risk in part because he had been scheduled to leave San Francisco to serve in the National Guard. Bail was set at $300,000. Conditions reportedly included an ankle monitor, surrendering his passport, forfeiting weapons, and being subject to searches. A preliminary hearing was set for April 9th. So officially, the case is still in motion. And that means what we know now may not be the whole story. That is important. Because at this stage, people often rush into one of two extreme positions. Either they decide instantly that Wood is a cold-blooded killer hiding behind a convenient explanation, or they decide the case is nothing more than a freak accident and any further suspicion is unfair. But real cases rarely feel that neat this early. Sometimes the initial charge stays exactly where it started. Sometimes evidence reveals more than prosecutors first knew. Sometimes reconstruction strengthens the original explanation, and sometimes it tears it apart. That is why the physical details matter so much here. Think about trajectory alone. If Samantha was in the bathroom, where exactly was Nation standing? Was he seated? Was he standing upright? Was the firearm pointed horizontally? Downward? At what height? What kind of gun was it? Was a round chambered? Was the magazine removed but the chamber not cleared? Was this, in reality, a classic and devastating mistake involving a semi-automatic weapon, one where a person removes the magazine and mistakenly believes the gun is safe, forgetting there is still a round in the chamber? That possibility has been discussed because it is one of the most common serious errors people make with firearms. And that detail matters even more because Wood was not, allegedly, just casually unfamiliar. The very use of the term dry firing suggests familiarity with weapons handling. It suggests someone who knew the concept well enough to name it. So again, the question becomes more pointed. If you understand the concept, how do you fail the first rule of it? Experts who have discussed the case publicly have emphasized that proper dry fire practice begins with clearing the weapon, visually checking the chamber, removing ammunition from the immediate area, and controlling the environment. In other words, if done correctly, it is deliberate, methodical, repetitive, safe. What is being alleged here is the opposite of that, and maybe that is why this case has gotten under people's skin so quickly. Because the details feel both highly specific and deeply senseless at the same time. A White House-related security professional, inside a shared apartment, handling a gun, calling it dry firing, one wall away from a young woman in the bathroom. And then, suddenly she is gone. It almost sounds too absurd to be real. And yet Samantha's death is very real. Sometimes that is what makes a story so hard to process. Not mystery in the traditional sense, but the unbearable plainness of a fatal act that should never have happened. And there is another layer here that people do not always say out loud. When a woman dies in a home she shares with a partner, many people immediately become cautious about what comes next. Not because every case is the same, not because every man is guilty, but because too many women have died in private spaces and been reduced almost immediately to a version of events controlled by the only other person left alive in the room. That is why people lean in so hard when they hear a case like this. Not because they want drama, because they want certainty. Because they want to know whether Samantha's final moments were truly the result of one catastrophic mistake, or whether the story of that night is still missing pieces. And if you're listening to this and thinking, maybe people are reading too much into it, that is fair. It is fair to say that accidents do happen. It is fair to say that negligence can be deadly without being intentional. It is fair to say that even trained people make stupid, irreversible mistakes. But it is also fair to ask hard questions when the mistake is this severe. Would you call this a horrible accident? Or do you think the word accident sometimes softens conduct that is obviously reckless? That tension is going to follow this case all the way through, because even if prosecutors never allege intent, the public still hears certain details and cannot let them go. One of those details is the setting itself. This was not a rural property, not a detached training structure, not an outdoor environment. This was an apartment, a shared apartment, A place with close walls, limited space, and another person nearby. And that is where the case becomes even harder to absorb. Because safe firearm handling is not just about whether you think a weapon is loaded, it is also about where you point it. What is behind the surface you are aiming toward? What room is on the other side? Whether someone could be there? Whether the environment itself is completely inappropriate for careless handling? In other words, even before anyone gets to the chamber, the magazine, the trigger, or the terminology of dry firing, there is a more basic question. Why was a firearm being manipulated in that way inside that apartment at all? That is not a legal conclusion. That is a human one. The more you sit with this case, the more it begins to feel like Samantha died at the end of a long line of decisions that should have been interrupted far earlier. And that is what makes these cases so infuriating, so haunting, so difficult for families to process, because there is no mystery about whether the death was preventable. Everything about it suggests that it was. Samantha had reportedly posted memories of travel, of life with Nation, of building a real adulthood together. That phrase stays with me. Building a real adulthood. It sounds so normal, so sweet, so young. The kind of caption people make when they are excited about the ordinary future they're creating with someone. And now that line feels unbearable, because she was not killed in some random act by a stranger on the street. She died inside the intimate geography of her own life, in a home she shared, near someone she trusted, in the middle of a completely ordinary evening that turned fatal in seconds. That is what gives this case its emotional weight. Not just the professional angle, not just the White House connection, not just the question of training. It is the betrayal of the familiar, the bathroom, the wall, the apartment, the person in the next room. Those are details that make a case sink in deeper than a headline ever can. And for a lot of viewers, that is also why the phrase "through the wall" lingers so disturbingly, because it creates a kind of distance and closeness at the same time. Samantha was not allegedly standing face-to-face with the shooter. She was not described as being directly involved in handling the firearm. She was in another room. That makes the danger feel almost invisible, almost unreal, until you remember that walls do not stop bullets the way people emotionally want them to. A lot of people think of walls as protection, separation, safety. But in a shooting, a wall can become almost meaningless in an instant. That is one reason the forensic side of this case matters so much. If a bullet truly passed through a wall, and possibly through bathroom materials as well, investigators will be able to examine deformation, angle, probable energy loss, wound characteristics, and scene positioning. That does not answer every question about intent, but it can answer whether the claimed mechanics are plausible. And sometimes, plausibility changes everything. If the evidence supports his account, then this becomes one of the most devastating examples of fatal negligence imaginable. If the evidence does not support it, then the case may become something else entirely. That is why early cases like this are so delicate. People want certainty immediately, but reality often arrives in layers. First, the emotional narrative, then the legal narrative, then the physical narrative. And those three do not always line up right away. For now, the legal narrative is that Nation Wood is charged with involuntary manslaughter. His attorney has framed the shooting as a horrific accident, and the court, at least at this stage, is treating the case seriously enough to impose substantial bail and restrictions. But emotionally, for many people, the case has already expanded beyond that label. It has become symbolic of something larger. The danger of careless firearms in intimate spaces, the way expertise can sometimes create overconfidence, and the unbearable unfairness of a young woman dying because someone else, allegedly, did not do the most basic thing correctly. It is also, quietly, a story about reputation collapsing in real time. Think about how fast that happened. One moment, Nation Wood's public image included elite-adjacent security work, government-linked experience, and the kind of resume that signals competence. Then, suddenly, his name is attached to one of the worst allegations imaginable, that his negligence with a firearm killed the woman he lived with. Cases like this remind people that professional identity does not protect anyone from personal recklessness. In fact, when the person involved is trained, the fall feels harder. The contradiction feels sharper. The public expectation is higher. If a person with no background in firearms did something careless, people might say ignorance was part of the problem. But when the person is allegedly familiar with weapons, procedure, and security culture, then ignorance no longer feels like an explanation. It feels like failure. And that, I think, is why this case is going to stay with people. Because even if every fact in his account were true, it still leaves behind a terrible question. How can someone know so much and still do something so fatally stupid? Maybe that sounds harsh. But Samantha lost her life. Harsh is sometimes the only honest way to speak about negligence when the consequences are permanent. There is another detail worth sitting with here, and it is one that often gets buried once legal language takes over. Samantha was only 22. 22. At that age, most people are still barely stepping into adult life. You are trying to figure out work, identity, relationships, money, future plans, where you belong, who you want to become. Every year ahead still feels available. Every version of your life still feels possible. That is why youth changes how a case lands. It does not make an older victim matter less, of course not. But there is something uniquely heartbreaking about a life interrupted this early, especially when the interruption comes from something so profoundly preventable. Samantha was not at the end of a long life. She was at the edge of beginning one, and now, everyone around her is left with that cruel split screen, the version of her life that was unfolding and the version that ended in a hospital after a shot in her own apartment. If you've ever lost someone young, you know exactly what I mean. It is not just grief over who they were. It is grief over who they never got to become. And when a death comes with unanswered questions, that grief becomes even heavier. Because mourning gets mixed with analysis. Memories get mixed with anger. And every retelling of the case reopens the same wound. What really happened in those final moments? That question matters legally, yes, but it matters even more personally. Did Samantha know what was happening in the other room? Did she hear anything before the shot? Was there conversation? Silence? Music? Running water? Did the sound register as danger instantly or not at all? We may never know those details. And sometimes the not knowing is its own kind of torment. That is part of what makes domestic space deaths so uniquely unsettling. A home is full of tiny, ordinary routines: brushing teeth, taking a shower, folding clothes, making food, charging your phone, talking through the doorway. These are the most unguarded moments of life. And when violence or negligence erupts there, it can feel like the most basic trust in everyday existence has been broken. The bathroom should not become a crime scene. A shared apartment should not become the place where a life ends because someone mishandled a gun. And yet, here we are. Now, I want to talk about something that usually makes people uncomfortable. But it matters in cases like this: the difference between intent and moral responsibility. Legally, those are not the same thing. A person may not intend to kill and still be morally responsible for setting the conditions that made death likely. That is one reason involuntary manslaughter exists. The law recognizes that some conduct is so dangerously careless that the absence of intent does not excuse the outcome. And maybe that is the most important distinction in this whole case. Because even if no evidence ever shows deliberate intent, that does not turn Samantha's death into something blameless. It does not mean this was unavoidable. It does not mean what happened should be emotionally softened into a tragedy with no human cause. Someone allegedly handled a loaded weapon. Someone allegedly pulled the trigger. Someone else died. That chain does not disappear just because the defense says the result was accidental. Sometimes people hear accident and imagine something random, like slipping on a wet floor or being struck by debris in a storm. But many so-called accidents are really the end result of ignored precautions, bad judgment, arrogance, laziness, distraction, or overconfidence. The word sounds passive. The behavior usually is not. And that brings us to the concept of criminal negligence. Criminal negligence is not a tiny lapse. It is not a harmless oversight. It is conduct so careless that a reasonable person should have understood the risk. It is the kind of behavior society looks at and says, "No, this crossed a line." Even if you did not want the outcome, your actions were so dangerous that the law cannot treat them as merely unfortunate. If prosecutors are able to show that here, then the involuntary manslaughter charge makes sense. If they find stronger evidence, that could change. If they cannot prove enough, the defense will lean heavily into the horror of a mistake. That battle is still ahead. But outside the courtroom, most people are not thinking in jury instructions. They are thinking in gut-level terms. Should Samantha still be alive? Yes. Would she likely still be alive if basic firearm safety had been followed? Also yes. And that is enough for many people to feel that no explanation, however polished, will ever make this acceptable. There is also the issue of language. The phrase dry firing can almost sound technical, controlled, even harmless to those unfamiliar with guns. But in this case, the phrase may actually be doing a lot of work for the defense in the court of public opinion. It makes the action sound like a training mistake rather than what it may have physically been, pulling the trigger of a loaded firearm inside a residence. That distinction matters, because words can calm a story down, and sometimes they calm it down too much. Dry firing sounds like practice. Pulled the trigger on a loaded gun inside the apartment sounds like negligence. Which phrase feels closer to the reality Samantha experienced? That is not a legal question. That is a moral one. Now imagine her family hearing this story repeated in public. Imagine hearing your daughter reduced to the victim of someone else's horrific accident. Imagine being told, essentially, that her death came down to a mistake with a weapon that never should have been mishandled in the first place. How do you live with that? How do you forgive that, if you ever even can? How do you sit in a courtroom and hear arguments about terminology, background, intent, and procedure when the person you love is simply gone? These are the kinds of cases that split families, audiences, and communities. Some people focus on the absence of proven intent. Others focus on the enormity of the carelessness. Some look at Woods remaining at the scene and cooperating as evidence that he was not acting with malice. Others look at his background and think that only makes the negligence worse. And honestly, both reactions are understandable. That is the uncomfortable truth. A case can be both unintentional and deeply enraging. A defendant can appear devastated and still be criminally responsible. A shooting can be called accidental and still feel, to the victim's loved ones, like an act that can never be morally excused. Those tensions do not cancel each other out. They coexist. As this case moves forward, one of the most revealing moments may come when investigators present whatever reconstruction they have of the scene. The geometry of the apartment, the position of the shooter, the position of Samantha, the path of the bullet, the likely weapon function, the state of the firearm. Whether the explanation is mechanically consistent, those things may tell us more than any emotional statement ever could. Because scenes don't care about narratives, they care about physics, and physics can be brutally honest. If the bullet path fits exactly with what Wood claimed, that will matter. If the scene raises contradictions, that will matter more. Either way, Samantha deserves that level of scrutiny. Her case deserves more than assumptions, more than noise, more than people rushing to adopt whichever version feels easiest to emotionally live with. She deserves the truth. And maybe that is the sentence at the center of all of this. Not revenge, not speculation, not theatrics, just the truth. The truth about what happened in that apartment. The truth about whether this was exactly the reckless accident it appears to be. And the truth about whether anything in the first account fails to hold up once the physical evidence has had its say. Until then, the image that stays with people is hard to shake. A young woman in a bathroom, a shot through a wall, and a life ended by an act that should have been impossible if even the most basic safety rules had been respected. That is why this story has hit such a nerve. Because it is not just sad, it is senseless. And senseless deaths are often the hardest ones for people to accept. Before we close, I want to say Samantha's name one more time. Samantha Emge. Because in stories like this, the accused often becomes the center of attention. His background, his explanation, his court appearance, his future, his defense. Meanwhile, the victim risks becoming a silhouette around someone else's narrative, and that should never happen. Samantha was not just the girlfriend. She was not just the woman in the bathroom. She was not just the person on the other side of the wall. She was 22 years old, a recent graduate, a young woman with creative ambitions and a life that was still opening up. And now her family is left carrying the weight of an ending that never should have existed. As for Nationwood, his preliminary hearing is set for April 9th, and this case may look very different once more evidence comes into court. Right now, he faces involuntary manslaughter and has pleaded not guilty. That is where the legal process stands. But emotionally, the case is already much bigger than that. It is about recklessness, about trust, about the false comfort of walls, about what happens when someone who should know better allegedly fails in the most irreversible way. And it is about the terrifying speed with which ordinary life can collapse. 1 minute, you are in your apartment, moving through another routine night. The next, police are at the door, a young woman is dying, and two families are thrown into a reality neither of them can undo. That is what makes this case so haunting. Not just the shot, not just the charge, not just the White House connection. It is the ordinary setting, the intimate setting, the fact that the danger came from inside the life Samantha had built. And maybe that is the question I want to leave you with tonight. When a death is called an accident, what do we really mean? Do we mean unforeseeable? Or do we sometimes mean a preventable act so reckless that accident becomes the most bearable word available? Let me know what you think. Do you believe Nationwood's account holds up based on what we know so far? Or do you think the evidence may reveal something more troubling? And if you want more cases like this, cases that deserve to be talked about even when they are not dominating mainstream coverage, stay with me here. Because some stories are not just about what happened. They are about what the explanation says about responsibility, truth, and the value of a life that should never have been lost. And Samantha Emge deserved much, much more than this.